thank you all for coming today for this public lecture of Kathleen McLaughlin. And Kathleen is an award-winning investigative journalist who spent 15 years in China, working a lot on the medical industry in China and corruption within the same industry. So I don't want to take up too much of Kathleen's time talking, so I'll leave the words to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming today. I really appreciate it. This is my first time in Denmark ever, and it's beautiful. I'm not going to try and buy Greenland, so we can take that off the table. I'm a journalist, but I wanted to give you a little bit of background about myself, about how I got interested in this topic to begin with. So I'm not a doctor, not a scientist, although I do write for Science Magazine, but I'm a patient, and I was a patient the entire time that I lived in China. I have about 2 years before I moved to China in 2002, I was diagnosed with a rare chronic illness in which my immune system destroys my nerve cells. And if the condition isn't treated, it leads to paralysis and all sorts of things. I think most normal people wouldn't pack up and move to a country they didn't know much about when that happened, but I was young. So the treatment is a medication that's made from human blood plasma. And when I moved to China in 2002, I didn't know a lot, but I did know that the blood supply was compromised and very unsafe. They had had an HIV scandal. People were infected through a bad plasma system and blood transfusion. So what I started doing was smuggling my own drugs into China because it was illegal at that time to import foreign blood into China. So I became a blood smuggler. And this lasted for about 12 years, the time that I was living in China. At the same time, as a patient, because I had to go to the hospital every 6 to 8 weeks and get my medication infused. Now you can imagine going to say you're a Danish person and you fly to the US and you smuggle in drugs and you show up with these drugs at a hospital and say, hey, can you infuse these for me? They'd probably call the police. But China was really at that time kind of the Wild West, and you could do this. And I mean, they knew that they could read the prescription, it was kind of a legit thing. So I ended up being a patient in the Chinese medical system with my own drugs for about 12 years. As a result of that, I saw a lot of things that most foreign correspondents didn't see because I was directly exposed to a system that they usually didn't have any relationship with. So I remember right away when I first got there and first started being engaged with the hospital system, I read a local news story that struck me. And the story said that 50% of all pharmaceuticals that you could get on the Chinese market, so 50% of all prescription drugs were fake, counterfeit, or compromised. So you can imagine living in a country as a Chinese person, and this is your only source for getting medication, and there's a 50-50 chance that the medication you're getting might not be the real thing, and it might be something that damages you. Now, things have changed immensely since then, but just giving you kind of some of the background to how I got interested in this story. I think that all investigative journalists, we try to be fair. We try to get all sides to the story. We try to do thorough reporting and understand what's really happening. But when you go into a deep story that takes you places for years and years, it's usually something personal that gets you there. So I just wanted to give you kind of my personal background to how I got involved in all of this. And I'm calling the talk Frauds, Fakes, and Fentanyl because to me they are all connected. And my point is that this is not an inherently Chinese problem by any means. We have the same problems in the US. We have these same problems all over the world. But there is a unique combination of things in China that's been going on for the last 20 to 30 years. It's number one, in medicine you have profits often at the very center of everything, ahead of people. And number two, you have, sorry, I forgot to change my slide. Number two, so you have profits, and then you have, oh, my slides aren't going, here we go. Anyway, I'll get back to that. You have profits. You have a large population of very poor people who don't have much power. You have a lack of free press and free expression. So when these things do happen, people have limited ability to complain about them. And then on top of that, you have a limited ability for people to do civil action lawsuits. And this is something that's very powerful in the US because we have a lot of pharmaceutical companies who have done terrible things, again, mostly on poor populations, but what has kept them in check over the years is the people have the ability to sue them when things go wrong, and that doesn't exist in China. So you have all of these factors happening at the same time, and I think it makes it kind of a uniquely dangerous place for patients. So just to give you some background on the science in China right now, Xi Jinping has called for China to undergo the science and technology great rejuvenation, which sounds very lofty. What it really means is they are pouring money into science, research, and development. So right now, they have increased their spending. China has increased their spending, government spending, on science, research, and development at a greater rate than any other large economy in the world. They want to be the world science superpower, which again, when you look around the world right now, particularly in the US when science is under attack, this is an admirable thing. This is not a bad thing. So you have China's GDP growing, you have the government making science and technology a priority, and that's just the background. So we've gone from being a place where 20 years ago, 50% of the pharmaceuticals available in hospitals and drugstores may have been fake, to being a place that wants to be a leading science superpower. Some of the downsides to what is going on in terms of spending right now is that, I think my computer might be frozen here, sorry. The actual improvements in health and lifestyle and medical care are lagging far behind economic growth and scientific advances. So on one hand, you have a scientist in China who got a lot of headlines for doing genetic editing with CRISPR technology on human embryos. On the other hand, you still have a very significant gap in available practical medical technology and availability of it for most of the population. So you have a big gap that's growing. There's also a big gap in ethics rules. And what that means is a lot of foreign companies who want to do innovative testing that isn't being done anywhere in the world will go to China and do their testing there because the ethics rules around scientific development and testing are a little softer. So for example, on the CRISPR baby story, I don't know if you paid attention to that at all, but it emerged after the fact that American scientists and research institutions were actually involved with the Chinese scientists. So we look at it as this, oh, China has this big problem. No, China doesn't quite have the same developed ethics rules that the rest of the developed world has right now, and countries like America are exploiting the loophole. So we're all complicit in this, in my opinion. This slide is kind of interesting. I took this picture at a monkey laboratory in Beijing, and this, to me, kind of represents the point that China is at with ethics right now. So this is the leading research facility for primate research in China. Medical research on primates is extremely controversial around the world. A lot of countries have banned it outright. It's not something that people are proud of doing. China is just now talking about limiting it, which is a big deal. It's a big step for them. So these scientists were working on Parkinson's disease treatment with monkeys, but they had come up with all these protocols for how to humanely treat the research animals. And so while they're doing gene editing on babies, they're having conversations that the developed world had 30, 40 years ago about basic things like ethics in animal testing. So there's a lot happening there right now. So this just gives you some of the background. I see what's happening here. My mouse is not cooperating for some reason. Okay, so I want to take you back about, boy, time flies, 30 years. And I wasn't there then, but I mentioned earlier that I take medication that is made from human blood. And I don't know how much you all know about what happened in China in the 1990s with human blood, but I'll give you a little bit of a synopsis. So in the 90s, when China started connecting with the world and developing economically, every province in China started searching for their own economic golden egg. So in a lot of places, they would have natural resources that they could harvest and exploit. Other places, they turned into manufacturing hubs like Guangdong and Shenzhen. Henan province is the most populous province in China and also one of the most poor. They don't have natural resources. They have farms and they have a lot of poor people. So if you think of it in those terms, what Henan had was people to exploit. So someone in the government, I don't know who, came up with the idea that Henan was going to start something called the plasma economy. And they would pay poor farmers a certain amount of money, around $10, to donate their plasma. And then they would turn these plasma from farmers into pharmaceutical products that could be sold as a profit. And I remember I said China had banned the import of foreign blood. So they needed to make these products from domestic blood, and they didn't really have a system. So they started the system. The people of Henan had never in their lives had an opportunity to go out and just make cash. And it seems like a very controversial thing, maybe selling your blood, and particularly I think in China it's been quite taboo over the years. But this was an opportunity for people to get rich. They could buy things they'd never had. You know, they had the chance to catch part of this economic boom. So the blood banks became overwhelmed with people. And the result was they started doing things by cutting corners. So they would reuse equipment. They would reuse needles. They would reuse tubes. In a lot of cases, so when you donate plasma, they take the blood out, they separate it in a centrifuge, and they reinfuse your platelets, your red blood cells, back into your body, and they keep the plasma, which is just a protein liquid. In a lot of cases in Henan, because they were in such a rush and the process takes some time, they reinfuse people with other people's platelets. So they were giving people's blood back to the wrong person. So you can imagine what happened when one person with HIV entered the blood plasma bank system. It spread like wildfire. We still don't know how many people were infected. The best estimate is 1 million people. And we don't know because it's been very successfully covered up. People know about it, it's been written about, I've written about it, it's been discussed. The Chinese government has never done or conducted an independent investigation and publicized the results. They haven't allowed in independent investigators to count the total of what happened. So this woman on the slide is Dr. Gao Yaojie. She is now 93 years old and lives in New York City. She was a gynecologist who was living in Henan at the time, and one of her patients was dying of AIDS, and at that time the Chinese government was telling everyone we don't have AIDS, it's a foreign disease, but she knew. So she started going around and talking to people and discovered whole villages where more than 50% of the people living in the villages were infected with HIV. So she became a very effective whistleblower. And she was working in conjunction with another doctor who actually worked in the blood bank system and had done extensive testing on the blood, and she knew it was heavily contaminated with HIV. So they worked together, they got the word out, they got some solutions. The people who had been infected with HIV ended up getting free treatment, they ended up getting a few things, but then the attention started to go off, and it was covered up again, and eventually Gao Yaojie and her counterpart, who her name is Wang Shuping, I'll get to her later, they were not expelled, but they were forced to leave China for their own physical safety. The man who was the governor of Henan province at the time, just to give you an idea of how wide the cover-up was, the man who was in charge of the province at the time is now the second most powerful man in China. So he was promoted up and up and up and up and up. There weren't any consequences for him. I think if you wrote a textbook about the worst possible way to handle a public health crisis, this is probably it right here. But again, later, a few years later, China dealt with the SARS crisis. I don't know if any of you remember SARS, which was a big deal. And they did a pretty good job with that, eventually. What's interesting to me is that SARS affected mostly middle class and wealthier people in Beijing and Hong Kong. The people who were affected by the AIDS crisis were all poor. It was farmers living in poverty with very little power. And so I think you see a difference, a disparity in how people were treated depending on where they rank in society. We see that in the US too. So that's just to give you an idea of, once I started investigating this story, it was kind of funny because I was like, oh, this is why I don't use made in China blood products. And so I started interviewing, I was working on a piece, and I interviewed some Chinese men, it was only men at that time in this one place, who had my specific illness. And I said to them, they had to take the same medication, and I said, do you know about the problem with HIV? And they said, yeah, of course. And I said, well, I mean, how do you feel when they have the drug? And they said, there's nothing we can do about it. What do you want us to do? We don't have any other option. So I was so privileged to be able to smuggle in my own drugs and stay safe from this system. But people who were Chinese nationals who, didn't have money to go abroad or whatever, this is what they had for treatment. And it's still a problem today. Occasionally, I kind of monitor this news, and this is 30 years after the fact, you'll still see occasional stories about people contracting HIV or hepatitis through a blood transfusion. So the system has not been totally cleaned up yet. So all of this happened in China, along with a lot of other things that you may have heard about. It was for a very long time, in modern China terms, a domestic problem. It affected Chinese citizens only, as I mentioned. In the early 2010s, China started really going out into the world with its development, and a big part of that was in Africa. So you probably know, this is going really slowly and I don't know why. Sorry, there we go. China began investing in developing projects, roads, bridges, trains, ports, all sorts of infrastructure development in Africa. At the same time, they started doing aid, although not on the same exact model that we do in the West, but they started doing things to help people in these countries as well. A lot of times it was very specific, practical things like infrastructure in medicine, building a hospital where they hadn't had a hospital before, sending doctors where they had no doctors for a couple hundred miles. So very practical things. I went to do a story in Tanzania and Uganda in 2012 because what was happening at that time was the countries around Lake Victoria, which is the largest freshwater lake in the world, has the highest rate of malaria in the world because of the lake. They were getting flooded with fake malaria drugs. So there was a market for malaria drugs. What happens in these countries is that because there aren't that many medical facilities, there aren't that many doctors, malaria is so common, you probably get sick or someone in your family gets sick with malaria every year. It doesn't make any financial sense to take a day off from work and go to a doctor and get malaria drugs. So what they do instead is just go to the pharmacy and buy malaria pills and take them the same way that we would take ibuprofen for a headache or something like that. So some reports started coming out, scientific studies, that up to half of all of the malaria treatment drugs being sold in several East African countries were fake, counterfeit, or substandard. And you can imagine with a treatment like that, it actually undermines the effective treatment because you're only getting maybe half strength of the drugs. Just to show you, it's really difficult to tell the difference. And I'll be honest, I don't remember now. On these packages, one is real and one is fake, and I can't even tell you which one it is. They're identical. This is from the Ugandan Drug Enforcement Authority office, and he showed me how they look. So you think, oh, it's fake. Who would ever take fake drugs? You have to be really stupid to do that. They're identical. They're exactly the same. Now, all of the evidence at that time pointed to these drugs coming from China, from underground factories that had been making the same drugs for the domestic market, and now they had a new market overseas. So I'm just thinking of, I had a hard time finding patients who had taken fake drugs because it's difficult to know what you've taken. But I finally found a doctor, a malaria doctor in Tanzania, who told me that she had taken fake pills. And I said, how did you know? And she said, I'm a doctor. I have malaria. I took them. I still have malaria. So it really was really obvious to her. And everyone knew that these drugs were all around. But they didn't have, again, we're talking about a poor population with very little power. So I published these stories in The Guardian, and within a week, I happened to be out of town, and my husband called me from Beijing, and he said, do we get the People's Daily? And I don't know if any of you are familiar with the People's Daily. It's the official state newspaper in China. And I said, no, what? He said, there's a copy on our front doorstep, and you're the lead story. And I said, oh, huh. The Chinese government was very unhappy with the reporting because, and then it later emerged that Xi Jinping's first international trip was to Tanzania. So he didn't want bad news coming out of that part of the world. What was interesting is I talked to some Ugandan journalists later, and China has done something very clever with international news. They've started Chinese media all around the world and hired the best local journalists because they want to establish credibility and a good presence. And so in Uganda, they hired all the best journalists. And the Uganda journalists working for Chinese state media were told to write stories disputing my reports, and they refused because they knew they were true. So it was an interesting kind of like, this is what happens when China actually hires the best journalists. They're going to refuse to do propaganda. So I heard about all this secondhand, and I thought it was super interesting. I don't know what happened in the end. My understanding is that the problem has subsided a little bit. An interesting thing about the fake malaria drugs, though, is they may have, and the science is a little fuzzy on this, but they may have contributed to the decline of one of China's most important scientific advances. So a few years ago, a woman named Tu Youyou, who was a Chinese woman, became the first Chinese person to win a Nobel Prize for medicine. And it was for discovering, inventing a malaria drug that's now the gold standard of treatment for malaria, artemisinin. Because of all of these fakes that have flooded in around the world, artemisinin has become much less effective. So it was the gold standard only for a couple of years, and now because of fakes that may have come from China, it's already fading out. So it isn't, I mean, it's deadly, it's dangerous, it's terrible. It's also undercutting China's reputation for the really good things that they have done in the world and should have protected. I mean, this is something that won a Nobel Prize. You would think it would be something the Chinese government would want to really safeguard against. But in all of this reporting, what I keep finding is if there's a market for medication, you're going to have things flooding in, which now brings me to the US and our market, our really sad market. So you've probably all heard about the opiate crisis in the US. The latest figure I could find was that more than 200,000 people have died of drug overdoses, opiate overdoses, in the last few years in America. In 2017, there were 77,000 opiate deaths. More than half of those were caused by a drug called fentanyl, which up until a few years ago, most of us had never heard of. Unless you were a doctor, you didn't know what fentanyl was. So what was happening is the US population that was addicted to opiates became addicted to opiates because of pharmaceutical companies, American pharmaceutical companies pushing overprescription of opiate painkillers to a certain population, mostly in the heartland and the Rust Belt, in economically depressed areas. A whole generation of people became hooked on these pills. The pills started to disappear because people figured out they were extremely addictive. Doctors started prescribing them less, but it still left the addiction. And so people started turning to street drugs. And first that was heroin. Heroin's always been around. It usually comes from cartels in Mexico into the US. And I've never done heroin, so I'm speaking from the experience of this young man and other people that I've interviewed, but my understanding is when you're addicted to heroin, you're always chasing the next high. So you're doing drugs and you keep doing more and more and more because you want that perfect high, that really, really strong high. Well, that's what fentanyl does. You add a little fentanyl to your heroin and you're on the moon. The problem is, it also can kill you very easily. So let me show you fentanyl so you have an idea of what I'm talking about. This is a picture from the US Drug Enforcement Agency lab in Washington, D.C. Those little grains clinging to the inside of the test tube, and this is a test tube about this big, it's tiny. 2 or 3 grains can kill you. It's almost nothing. It's outrageously powerful stuff. So fentanyl in this test tube was legal in China. They didn't have an opiate problem. They had a large chemical industry. It was perfectly legal to buy fentanyl over the internet. If you were sitting in the US and you wanted to buy fentanyl and you knew what it was, you could mail order it to your house, which is what started happening. So drug dealers and cartels started purchasing fentanyl from China, getting it mailed to Canada, the US, Mexico, cutting it into the heroin supply, and users have a stronger drug. The problem is fentanyl is much more deadly than heroin. It's really, when you can see the size, the amount that it takes to kill you. So the US and Mexico have been asking China for years to do something about this. The problem really became severe in 2015. That's when it started showing up everywhere. So China did start regulating it. First they banned the sale of fentanyl. Then they, but the problem is fentanyl, and I'm going to show you another slide here that's kind of interesting. Fentanyl is an unusually easy chemical to alter. So you can snap off, this is a model of fentanyl right here, and this is a scientist from the USDA. You can change one of the molecules, you can snap one off, you can snap one on. It becomes a completely different chemical that's no longer regulated, but it still produces the same effect. And the problem is, these drugs then become an experimentation on opiate addicts because they're brand new drugs. We don't know what they do. So in places like Cincinnati, which was kind of the epicenter of the US opiate epidemic, the scientists in the coroner's lab, every week they get new toxicology reports back and they have no idea what the drugs are that kill someone. They're unidentifiable. So they spend weeks and weeks and weeks backwards reconstructing them so they can identify them. And they can't be scheduled as illegal drugs when they don't know what they are. China can't do anything about it when they don't know what they are. So it's this backwards race against science. You have very good scientists, chemists in China creating these drugs, and scientists in the US and Canada chasing them backwards. So, oh, and I should say, most of the evidence that these drugs came from China is pretty clear. It's mail. So there's a lot of mail receipts and mail shipments. I was speaking with Lena before, and then she asked me, don't they catch these things in customs inspection? Well, less than 1% of everything that enters the US is actually inspected. So you'd probably send me anything and no one would ever find it. We just don't have enough people to inspect all of the stuff that comes across the borders. So this fentanyl is just coming in through the mail. Drug dealers cut it into heroin. Opiate addicts take it, they love it, they die. It's been so severe that in places like Cincinnati, they've actually found a drug called carfentanil, which is an elephant tranquilizer in the heroin supply. I mean, it's just crazy. So again, this is mostly happening on poor people until April 2016, Prince. So Prince, you all know who Prince is, I don't need to describe him. He was taking what he believed to be Percocet, which is a very old prescription painkiller, a mix of acetaminophen and opiate. He was actually taking a street drug, a copy, a counterfeit Percocet. It was stamped to look just like a regular Percocet, and it contained fentanyl. He overdosed and died. When that happened, I think a lot of people in the US began to realize that this was a real problem. I mean, it's sad to say that tens of thousands of ordinary Americans who weren't at Prince's notoriety level died before it happened. But when he died, I think people went, wait a minute, this is a problem. And in the years since, you've seen a lot of pushbacks against the drug companies. You've seen a lot of demands for China to put an end to this. Lena also asked me if China could end the US opiate crisis, and I said absolutely not. We still have addicts. We still have people who are addicted to drugs. China is simply filling a demand that's there, and they're filling it with something that's particularly deadly. But the ultimate responsibility lies with the US and finding some kind of treatment programs for people who are addicted. I mean, it's not, the US opiate crisis is not China's responsibility. Chinese drugs have made it much more deadly than it might have been otherwise. But I don't think if China suddenly, froze all of the chemicals that were coming into the US, I don't think the problem would go away. I think that it would come from somewhere else. It might be deadly. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, but why do they do that? I mean, usually as a drug company, you want to keep your customers alive. So they can demand a lot.
This is a really good
For me,
point.
it sounds so stupid. So why do they want to do that?
I shouldn't laugh, but it's a really good point. Did everyone hear what he said? Is that as a drug company, you want to keep your customers alive? I don't know. I mean, the demand is there. Like I said, if you're using opiates, the idea is you always want the next big high, and this really is the big. Not everyone who does fentanyl dies. the real problem, and actually the death rate has gone down a tiny bit in the last year, but the real problem is when people don't know what they're taking. So if it's mixed into the heroin that you think you're taking, or it's mixed in at a higher rate, you don't know what you're taking, that seems to be the real issue. It's also, because it's so small, it's easier to move around than heroin. Heroin's much bigger. Fentanyl, little tiny packages can go for a lot of money. And who knows, maybe they think there's an inexhaustible supply of people who are addicted to opiates. I really don't know. It's a good question. I mean,
It is very difficult to get the right amount.
Yeah, exactly.
And if it's going on the black market, then people make
It's
mistakes.
being cut by drug dealers who
Right,
aren't chemists, who don't know exactly what they're doing.
I mean, it's much cheaper than the heroin. I mean, so
Yeah.
of course the dealers on the ground, they want to make more money,
Right,
so they just
Yeah,
do the
that's
best
right.
they can, and sometimes
That's
they
right.
overdo it.
Yeah. So this kind of brings me back to my original point, which is this is not an inherently Chinese problem. I've been talking about fakes and frauds and fentanyl and all of these terrible things and people dying. And all of these things, yes, are coming from China because of what I described earlier, that having a unique set of factors, a lack of free press, a lack of being able to sue over things, a lack of effective regulation. But you remember I told you about the plasma economy in Henan, which just seems grotesque when you think about it. I finally had to move back to the US a couple of years ago because Chinese hospitals decided that they couldn't infuse my smuggled drugs anymore. And back, I started again kind of looking into under the skin of what was going on. And the US has created the plasma economy. If you are a plasma donor, and they encourage college students and poor people, they set up these clinics mainly in economically underprivileged areas of the US. You can go in twice a week, donate plasma, and you earn around $300 a month. It's real money for people who are living on the margins. It is also completely scientific, unstudied. We don't know what it does to people long term. Just to give you an idea, so say you're a plasma donor who earns $300 a month by donating twice a week. The medication that I take that's made from a derivative or a portion of human plasma is $12,000 a dose. So the gap between the donors and the profit-making pharmaceutical companies is massive. So we have actually built the same system. It's just we've been lucky. We don't have an AIDS crisis right now. There isn't a viral bomb waiting to happen. But I want to tell you about one more person, and this is Dr. Wang Shupeng. She lives in Salt Lake City now. She was a doctor who worked in the blood banks in Henan province, and she actually discovered the problem. And she brought it to the highest levels of government in Beijing. She told them there is HIV in the plasma banks. We need to stop this. And they didn't shut down the plasma banks for another 3 months. And so they knew that this issue was happening, and it kept going. She was quite young at the time. She was in her 30s. And when it became clear that she was going to be punished for this, she found a job in the US and left. And she lives now in Salt Lake City, is a cancer researcher at a university hospital. And I wanted to write about her because I think she's really interesting. She hasn't gotten the attention that the other whistleblowers on this issue have gotten, but she's really the one who was the medical researcher who found it and exposed the problem. So I went to see her in Salt Lake. I stayed with her for a few days, and she's wonderful. We had a lot of nice talks. And somewhere along the way, she said, I want to show you something. And we had been talking. She was explaining to me how the problem started in China and the crazy pace that the plasma banks were working at, that it was just constant churn of taking people's blood. And she said, I want to show you something. And I said, okay. So we got in her car, and we drove to a strip mall in Salt Lake City. And she was taking me to a plasma bank. And she said, I want to know how this works here. So we went in and started asking questions. And I asked a bunch of questions. She asked one question. She said to the person behind the front desk, what day of the week do you close? He said, oh no, we're open 7 days a week. And I could see her mind going, you've done the same thing. So nothing has happened happened yet, but this person who discovered this epidemic in China and who blew all the warning bells and was ignored and chased to the US is now seeing the same framework that's happening in America and the same kind of exploitation of poor people by pharmaceutical companies without, I'm not saying, and I'm someone who depends on human plasma to not be paralyzed, so I need it. But here's an interesting thing. You might think in Denmark that because Denmark doesn't pay for plasma, so it's a little bit morally more comfortable. I don't know the exact figure in Denmark, but I do know that in Switzerland, in one of the major biotech companies, one of the big three that processes plasma for medication, 70% of the blood plasma comes from America. America is the world's largest exporter of human blood plasma. And it's because we pay for it, and it's because we have a very large population of poor people that needs the extra money. So it's not something that stays in America only, it's something that we export to the rest of the world, so the rest of the world can comfortably have these medications without knowing that they're involved in this exploitive system. And I don't know what the answer is, but it's a little bit of a shock to go from, I lived in China for so long thinking, oh, well, this would never happen in my country. It's already happened. We just haven't had a crisis because of it yet. So I don't know what's gonna happen next. Just a few, if I can make my mouse move, final thoughts on what we can do to fix these problems in China and the US too. So I think people need to be at the center of medicine ahead of profit. I understand that pharmaceutical companies are always going to want to make a profit, but oftentimes people are put behind profits, and in every case that I have described here, people are less important than profits. And I think that goes to your question too. Yeah, they might be killing people, but they earn money from it. So it's really money ahead of people. The second thing is, and particularly with China, is to improve effective regulation and actually use the regulations that you have on the books. And then the third thing, and the thing that's really the most important to me, because it's a problem all around the world right now, particularly in the US, is that we need to advocate for free expression and free press and the rule of law. All of these things that I've been talking about came to light because of whistleblowers who are willing to speak up and because of journalists who are willing to write about it. And without those, we wouldn't know what was going on in the world. So that helps keep us safe, and those are things I think we need to protect. That's it.